Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called The Humans Aren't Alright, written by JohnGaldt. Bob turned the headset over in his hands, his eyes running around the simple metal loop. He looked around at the others. They smiled and laughed quietly to themselves. He felt a scowl pull on his face, an unfamiliar sensation. He didn't like it. He would find something interesting in the loop. He always did. But that didn't seem to be enough. Gordon eased along his rail, coming down to settle beside Bob, his cameras twitching over Bob's face.
Are you all right, Bob?
I don't know.
May I scan you?
Bob twitched up 2 fingers to give consent, his focus falling off the loop to the other aliens, each wearing their own. They looked pleased, contented countenances which contained pleasant, polite smiles. He put down the loop and stepped along between the couches, seeing the occasional human as he went. Gordon followed him, his eyes focused intently on Bob's head. I feel like I want something different, like I'm missing something, said Bob. Gordon, the caretaker, hummed to himself thoughtfully.
You seem in perfect health. Can you elaborate further on your feelings, Bob?
Bob stepped aside, casting his eyes heavenward, seeing an endless dither of green and white running around the inside of Sanctuary DQW. Aliens walked and played in the gardens. He could do the same, but he really knew that he wasn't what he needed. It's like a craving that I cannot place, like when my body mistakenly believes it is low on a particular nutrient.
You are drawing a parallel. This is not a craving?
No.
It'll rain tomorrow. Then that will provide a nice break in your usual schedule,
mused Gordon. He switched over to our outside rail, following Bob onto the grass, easing along the garden edge with him until Bob paused by a small machine pruning a plant. Bob watched the little sharp hand tool slice through the plant's flesh. What is he doing?
Pruning. Some plants require simulated consumption to encourage growth.
Growth felt good. Bob hadn't felt like he had growth in years, a change of physiology that leads to a change of mind, habits, and desires. He'd finished puberty 6 years ago, and life had been the same since. May I see that tool? Gordon was silent for a moment, which was unlike him. The camera focused intently on Bob, then eased down slowly to the garden bot. Gordon deployed his arm and transferred the tool from the garden bot to Bob.
Secateurs, do you wish to start your own garden?
Something like that, said Bob as he eased the secateurs over his thumb. There was a sudden spark deep inside of him. Something new. It rose up through Bob, lifting his heart rate into a flutter. He felt short of breath. His hands tightened around the handle, feeling the sensation intensify as the metal eased tighter into his skin.
Bob, what are you doing?
I don't know, said Bob. It hurt, more than he'd ever felt. He sucked in a sharp breath as he squeezed tighter, pangs of pain shooting up his arm, taking away his control. He would cut it off and he would grow. He knew he wasn't a plant, but this was the closest thing he had felt that filled the void, likely a newly discovered key entering a lock he didn't know he needed. A small, molluscoid alien listened to his companion, cast a wary eye at Bob and started to slide away along the grass. He squeezed tighter, but not as hard as he wanted to. He tried again, but his hand only firmly gripped it. He knew that he was stronger than this. He reached out to the woody branch, and, as expected, it snipped straight off with little resistance, but when wrapped around his thumb, his hand refused to do it. Gordon loomed closer, breaking the bubble of personal space he almost never entered. Is this you, Gordon?
No, you can't cut off your own thumb. Your body won't allow you to do it. It is a protective instinct similar to your inability to bite your tongue.
Bob gave it a go, and as expected he could only bite his tongue with equal force to how hard he could cut into his thumb. Red blood glittered down the metal, and it was there again, that rising rush, the wind and spark, but he could go no further. His own body was padded barrier set against him. You promise this isn't you, said Bob.
By my manufacturer and the honor of the 92 iterations of code that came before me, I am not preventing you from damaging yourself. Would you like to use the loop to research gardening? We could find plants that require regular pruning together.
Gordon's hand eased down towards the secateurs, to Bob's traitorous hand, to his self-imposed limits. Bob felt his face draw into something twisted, his nose curling, unfamiliar muscles twitched to life. His teeth sheared over each other, his tongue running over the point and molar. His jaw was set, his eyes flickered up to Gordon, who moved closer still. Aliens glanced his way and started to back off. Not the humans, though. Eyes flickered over him everywhere. Others turned to stare, stepping through gardens. Confusion flitted across their face as he held their attention. Gordon's plastic shell brushed against Bob. Bob dropped the secateurs and put his hands on Gordon, and he heaved him away. The safety of his rail giving out, causing the caretaker to slide away a few inches down the line. Bob wasn't breathing enough. His nerves were electric. His face twisted, but he had never felt better. He was wrong. He shouldn't.
"I'm sorry. Are you okay?"
said Bob.
"I am undamaged. Did you hurt yourself?"
"I don't think so,"
said Bob.
"The secateurs."
Bob glanced down, following Gordon's camera, and saw them sticking blade up in the grass. He nodded and stepped away from the hazard, letting Gordon take his place to offer them back to the garden bot. He stood back, hand in his heart, feeling a thud through his chest.
"Bob, this is Chloe. Chloe, this is Robert, or as he prefers to be called, Bob."
A human woman warily stepped up to Bob, her eyes flicking between Gordon and Bob's, her attention eventually falling onto Bob, her eyes running down the strip of red that stained his otherwise perfect white tunic.
"Can you do that to me?"
Bob stared at her for a moment. He lifted his thumb to see the stinging cut.
"No, not that,"
she said. She put her hands up and threw them away.
"A push,"
said Gordon.
"Can you push me?"
Bob stepped into her, his hands on her shoulders, and jumped away, throwing her back and stumbling feet until she crashed to the grass. Her eyes were wide as she coughed, but then she smiled, a real smile blooming across her lips. A laugh bubbled up inside of her until it burst free. She had too much emotion to contain, rising up until it broke free and poured out of her. She looked down at the red stain she had left on her. She hefted herself up off the grass, her face twisting into a wrathful glee until her hands thudded into his chest. He stumbled back a pace. It felt just as good to be pushed as it did to push. He threw her back, but this time she was ready for it and braced her weight against him, their arms tangling into a mess, their feet driving down into overturning soil, bruising the grass and stumbling together. Laughter sounded out around them, and feet puddled up close as someone pushed Chloe from the side, catching her off guard and hurling her down to the soil with a start. She laughed with tears in her eyes. Bob stared at a new person.
"Bob, this is John. John, this is—"
Bob's fingers curled around themselves tight as his hand swung around, clubbing John across the jaw. The intruder hit the grass with a heavy thud. Bob looked up and saw a dozen humans. They started to push each other, all blissfully smiling. Gordon's peripherals were shoved occasionally, but always with an apology afterwards. Bob's face won. He turned to see Chloe's open hand and felt the heat wash into his cheek. She grinned up at him and thudded forward into his chest, this time with her arms open, wrapping them tightly around his waist. His own came down around her shoulders, squeezing her tightly, feeding the rush that came with it. She head-butted him sternum, and they fell apart, their hands curling into fists and turning their attention outward to the others shoving humans. Bob sat on a broken tree, transferring blood from his bleeding eyebrow into the last unstained patch of white on his tunic. Others had chosen brown from the earth. Chloe had black from the oil leaking from the automatic door that had been wrenched out of place. Gordon was busy disinfecting wounds.
"Do you feel satiated, Bob?"
"No, but I am feeling better."
Chloe sat to one side, and John on the other, shoulder to shoulder, staring at the sight, their eyes glittering at the embers that rose up. A tree was burning. It started with a small spark and had quickly grown into something vast and uncontrollable. The resulting heat spread far. He could hear them. Other humans on the grass, hundreds of them, the only species that sought to investigate the strange, destructive beacon in the night. End of story. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Bushmaster 177, Henry the Red, Caspar Arnholtz, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Elijah Silvercross, Dragzoon WRE, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.